No, I don't think the government gets it. I mean, I think particularly during this pandemic, there are people working in intensive care in our hospitals treating COVID who are now suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. There are plans in place when it comes to disaster relief or wars where we treat medics returning. Nobody's thinking about our medics suffering PTSD now with COVID.
So I'm going to start with an existential question. How are you?
I'm actually good. I'm actually really good.
Are you?
Thank you for asking. No, I mean, it's a question we don't often wait to receive the answer for, because we say, how are you? We say, fine, yes, in all languages. But actually, over the last year, it's been a question that actually we should ask and wait. And actually, I'm really pleased you asked the follow-up question, because the normal answer is, yeah, I'm fine. But actually, because, we've talked about this, you actually asked and inquired, actually, are you? Actually, today I am. But one of the things I've been keen to do over the last year is to explain more how I am honestly. And the problem, Alastair, is not simply because of my gender, but because of my job, being strong, macho, brave. These are all in the, when you look at the positive columns, these are essentials we assume, and I've always assumed, to be a successful leader. But over the last year, I've started to be more honest. And so I'm really pleased you followed up and asked, actually, are you? I haven't today, but there have been many, many days, including the recent past, where I've not been great. And it's only over the last year I've started to be honest publicly when I'm not okay. And there's a reason for that. And actually, you deserve huge credit for me being honest publicly, actually. But actually, I think if I'm not honest, I worry about particularly men of a certain age in certain jobs who are suffering in silence. And I think actually one of the things and it is a man thing more than a woman thing, do poorly is not actually talk. We'll talk about football and about politics and about Brexit and about clothes but not about how you are. And again, I'm not seeking to patronize you, but if an alpha male like you is honest about how you're feeling, but also you asked the second question, actually, are you? I think I'm hopeful, and I'm actually good today, honestly. Yeah, thank you.
So when things are not good, what are they like?
So my wife Sadia spots before I do, I think, when I'm not great. Melancholy, not communicative. I can function really well, so I can do a media interview. I can do a team meeting. I'm very good at giving the impression of being good. I think it maybe comes from the lawyer training. When you go into the court with your client, you've got to just turn it on. It's a switch. And then you leave that environment and it's not so great. And so it's when you come off, you have a down. The lack of adrenaline is a problem, Alastair. I thrive on adrenaline. I thrive on people, conversations on tubes, I love. Team meetings with people, bouncing ideas, I love. I'm a hugger, I hug people. All that being gone means it's been quite deflating. So in between a Zoom meeting, it's quite bleak, it's difficult to read a brief, having to read the same page 6 times. When I'm not doing public facing stuff, I won't shave. I've never enjoyed shaving, but I've realized with the job that I have, you've got to look presentable. And so, if my diary says no public facing stuff, internal meetings, I won't shave.
That's so interesting, because I said in my book about depression that one of the first things that goes for me is shaving.
Yeah,
I think a lot of men find that.
Yeah, definitely, without a doubt. We're jogging, but on simple things, Alastair. If I'm wearing trousers during the lockdown, it's a good sign. If I'm wearing, because obviously you got no idea what I'm wearing. I'm wearing trousers today.
I'm wearing a kilt.
I don't even want to go there. But yeah, so there are telltale signs, and the fascinating thing, Alastair, it is remarkable, and actually I've learned a lot from reading some of your stuff. Is Sadia spotted about 10 years ago. I was really, really, really busy, and she worked out that one of the reasons why I wasn't great was lack of. I love football, cricket. I used to play squash a lot. Now I've recently taken up tennis again. So, and I didn't have time because when my mates were playing football, I was busy, and I stopped playing cricket a while ago. So she bought a foldaway running machine, and it was transformative because I could steal a half an hour jog on the machine or an hour jog, and I didn't sort of say, let me go and buy a machine because I need a running machine. But she'd clocked that I didn't have the time to go and do stuff, and so it's just remarkable how those who live with you can spot it. So the kids will know when I'm being, miserable or grumpy, as they call it, and stuff. And they're great when they're around. And so, but yeah, so I've never needed to be medicalized. I've never gone to a GP or a psychiatrist or a psychotherapist. When I used to be a lawyer, many of my clients suffered from post-traumatic stress. So I'm familiar with diagnostic criteria. I read a lot. And I've sort of self-taught how to be resilient. There was a period during the lockdown where I felt really down. I mean, I've never felt suicidal, thankfully.
It's interesting you use the word melancholy, which is a really old-fashioned word. And you talk about leaders. Abraham Lincoln defined himself as melancholic, but what it means is depressed. You don't. So, do you think you say you don't? Do you think you would have maybe gone to see a doctor if you hadn't have been in a position of public profile?
Let me tell you a funny story. So when I was younger, I remember when I became a baby lawyer, we'd often ask for medical records to do a case. And there is a stigma having in the medical notes, the GP's notes, depression. And you'd be conscious about what the medical notes said. And I think it's because of that, Alastair, not because, of this. I prejudge people with mental health issues, but I think subconsciously, I've just thought, I don't want to have it on my records that I've got depression. I've never heard, let me be frank, about a politician being depressed. We know about Churchill's black dog, and we know about Lincoln's melancholy. And I've got to be honest, you're the first person in politics, I know you're not a politician, but as good as, who's talked about it. And even when the princes talked about it, I took a step back. I mean, they're younger than me, but it's like, wow, Campbell, William, Harry are talking about, and you were all three of you used depression. And I've read a lot about this. Lots of great women writers, lots of and that was the first time in the public domain. I've got no experience, Alastair, of contemporary politicians, male ones, talking about it.
There was a Norwegian Prime Minister who stepped down to get treated, and Jeff Gallop, Western Australian Prime Minister, he resigned because he found he couldn't do the job.
That being said, I remember the first Mayor's Question Time I did after the interview, and there were questions from Tories about whether I should have stepped aside because of my mental ill health. And it's that sort of attitude that leads to men in particular, or anybody in a position of power and influence, not wanting to talk about it because you question whether I'm able to do the job. And so question, will people take the risk of talking about it if the fear is they're being asked whether they can do their job? Do you know what I mean? That's why you've got to be...
But that's why when you said, it was interesting, you said, thankfully I've never been suicidal, right? I have. So on my scale, I've maybe gone a bit further than you, but you've obviously been, between really good mental health and that, which I see as the kind of ultimate in ill health. So how far along that track do you need to go before you think, actually, I do need to go and see somebody? Not just talk about it openly, but go and see somebody.
Yeah, well, let me tell you. So I'm cheating with the answer a bit. Let me tell you why I'm cheating. Because one of my best mates is a doctor. Mm-hmm. And it was him that said to me about 2 years ago, you need to be doing sports. And he introduced me to tennis. And actually, my tennis with him is basically therapy, Alastair. I mean, so when I say I've not needed to be medicalized, I've not needed to be prescribed medicine. But I would say, if I'm honest, and this is why I've got to be honest with your readers, my mate who's a doctor, he's actually treating me. Right? He's not prescribing me drugs, but he's treating me because he will listen to me. He will, advise me. But actually, I realised that what he was doing in a very clever way was making me play sports with him, and he'll make sure I go football on a Sunday because he appreciates when it's allowed, because he appreciates how important it is to me. And so I think, but for me, having a mate who's a doctor, but for my wife spotting the things I need to do to be resilient and to stay medically fit. We talk about physical fitness over mental fitness. I've avoided the need to go to my GP, but I still think in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, I may not be able to become head of MI5, not that I want to be, or head of MI6 because of my GP records, because of my lawyer training from 20 years back. Does that make sense?
Yes. So what you're basically saying is the stigma, even when you've been open like you have, the stigma is still a factor when you're thinking about how you deal with it and how you address it.
I think so. Even now, that's why I was really keen to do this, because I think I remember speaking to Ruth Davidson. Ruth's been really open about her mental ill health when she was younger, but only recently. But I think there is something about when you are a leader still in your job, and I'm still the mayor and tend to be the mayor for some time, being as honest as I've been, which made me think once, twice, three times. But I think the positives of me talking about it outweigh the negatives of me talking about it. I think we've reached a stage now in our city, and probably across our country, hopefully, where people recognise that even somebody he may on days be not have the best mental health, can still be a great mayor, and that's what I'm hoping.
I mean, by the way, just to let you know, the Norwegian Prime Minister, who he stepped aside, he wanted to resign, and the cabinet wouldn't let him. He just took leave of absence to get his depression sort of looked after for a bit, and he had the highest poll ratings of any leader in Europe at the time. So there, you never know. Maybe take a little break if you need it. But you've never been at that stage of thinking, do you know what? I can't do this for now.
No, I haven't. And I haven't. And actually, I thrive in my work. I always have. I'm blessed. I mean, every job I've had, whether it's been a lawyer, MP, or mayor, I've loved doing it. And I think actually, I've had mates who've lost their seats in Parliament and lost their jobs, and their mental health has really suffered. So actually, I thrive in my work, but I've never reached a position where I think my health is affecting my ability to do my work.
What's your take on the state of mental health services?
It's appalling. I mean, as somebody who's a parent or somebody who knows teenage children, look at adolescents, mental health services, they're awful. Ever since Adam was a boy, we've talked about parity of esteem. We've talked about mental health being the Cinderella service. All that is true. And that's why I think we can't just rely upon the government and the NHS sorting this. Those of us outside the NHS have got to help. So we've got initiatives across the city, making sure we have mental health first aid trainers. We've got normal first aid trainers. We've set up something called Thrive London, which is organic. So don't rely on the NHS about making sure we deal with this. We've got a good thinking app. So because the NHS is starved of resources, because things are appalling, we've got, Alastair, in London, we've got teenagers being sent to hospitals 200 miles away as inpatients. We've got teenagers whose eating disorders can't be treated because the time lag between GP seeing teenager and the universities or specialists seeing the teenager is often months and months and months. We've also got a situation where often social media is a negative in relation to expectations of young people, but also some of the bad stuff out there. So, I'll continue lobbying the government for decent resources for the NHS in relation to mental health. But in the meantime, I think we've all got to think what we can do in relation to not just resilience.
I get it, but do you have any sense that they get the mental health agenda and listen? Do they listen?
No, I don't think the government gets it. I mean, I think particularly during this pandemic, and let me get amazing just over the last week that's come to the fore, which any of us who knows doctors will know this. There are people working in intensive care in our hospitals treating COVID who are now suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. There are plans in place when it comes to disaster relief or wars where we treat medics returning. Nobody's thinking about our medics suffering PTSD now with COVID. when it comes to teenagers and the pandemic, nobody in government's talking about the mental trauma of this pandemic. I'll give you another example. We're teaching children not to hug people they love. Why? Because that can pass the virus on. What impact is it having on kids? Who's thinking about how we retrain children to hug once the pandemic is over? So, we're doing the little we can from City Hall, but we really need a concerted effort from government to address some of the consequences of this pandemic, the mental trauma, and I use the word trauma deliberately.
What's your relationship with central government generally, and in relation to the pandemic? I mean, I get the sense looking from the outside that it's pretty frustrating.
So, well, first, I think one of the reasons why I really struggled last March, April, May is that sense of helplessness, not being invited to Cobra, having no say over lockdown, test, trace, isolate, the ventilator's not working, not decent personal protective equipment, and there's that sense of I'm the mayor and I can't help. So, as far as Boris Johnson and HMG is concerned, structurally not great, but I do have really good relations with individual members of the cabinet and individual ministers, and even individual members inside Number 10. I think now with Dominic Cummings going, frankly speaking, I think things have become easier in relation to the command and control from one person. And let's be clear, he was the de facto leader, not Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister. Things have become easier.
Well, was he making decisions that Johnson should have been making?
Without a doubt. And so what frustrates me...
Like what?
So when it comes to conversations, I remember having conversations with the Prime Minister, and Dominic Cummings was in the room, and it's quite clear which of the two of them had read the brief and knew the detail and which one didn't, and who was making the decisions. This will all come out in the wash in the public inquiry. It'll need to come out in the wash.
Well, they'll avoid that like a plague.
I don't think they can. I don't think they can. Just look at the evidence. When it comes to the largest number of excess deaths of any country in Europe, the worst recession of any country of the G7, but also the clamour for questions to be answered, because this isn't the last pandemic we're going to have. This isn't the last even strain of coronavirus we're going to have, and so we've got to get used to addressing global pandemic, and that's why it's really important. Lessons are learned.
But Sadiq, you might have said they would never prorogue Parliament. You wouldn't have a Prime Minister lie to the Queen. Somebody who was found breaking the Ministerial Standards Code would have to resign. You say there has to be, but don't pretend that they won't try not to have one. Or if they do, it'll be one conducted by, their mates. That's what they're like.
And that's why it's really important. Those inside Parliament who aren't members of the government, but also those of us outside Parliament, exert pressure on them. Let's remind ourselves, at the end of the day, Cummings did go, right? But so that's
he went because he was rude about Boris Johnson's girlfriend. He didn't go because he went to Durham. He didn't go because he tells lies. He didn't go because he's more powerful than the Prime Minister. He went because of that.
Yeah, no, all that is true, Alastair. But if you and I were speaking, even 6 months ago, you may be saying, well, listen, Trump's going to win again. This guy gets away with almost anything, and our confidence in him going would have been quite low. But actually, one of the reasons we should be hopeful about the last 6 weeks in America, actually, it's not just the results of the presidential election. An insurgency was defeated. You got a situation where Republicans are voting for impeachment. Actually, the checks and balances in America appear to have worked. And I'm confident, actually, that the British public, when it comes to the next general election, or when it comes to the checks and balances we have in our country, will lead to a decent outcome. I think there will be a public inquiry, and I think we all need to learn lessons. The key thing, though, that we need to do is make sure that we hold to account the decision makers of the last year.
But just to get it right, you're saying that as the pandemic was taking hold of the country, Boris Johnson was less in charge of the decision-making in Number 10 than Dominic Cummings?
Yeah, there are periods where he was. There was a meeting I went to in Number 10 with Boris Johnson as a bilateral, where it was quite clear that Dom Cummings was far better versed in the coronavirus, in the options, in what Sage was saying than Boris Johnson.
What does that make you feel about who and what we've got as a Prime Minister?
One of the things that I've said for some time, as somebody who examined what he was like as mayor, is it's not true to say that he was a good mayor. See, what's happened is a number of Conservatives during the selection campaign and a number of journalists during the general election campaign, drank the Kool-Aid that he was a good mayor and would be a good Prime Minister. He wasn't a good mayor. He never did detail. He never paid attention to the intricacies of detail, whether it's policing, whether it's transport, whether it's air quality, whether it's housing. He just didn't. And so, yes, he's a decent campaigner. He does do hope well, but he's a poor leader. And I think to surround yourself in a cabinet with people who aren't the best of the talent you've got in Parliament, if you're a Conservative leader, is a sign of weakness to me, not a sign of strength. You compare Boris Johnson's cabinet with Margaret Thatcher's cabinet, with John Major's cabinet, with Tony Blair's cabinet, with Gordon Brown's cabinet. There were light years difference. Even Theresa May's cabinet, she had players around the room. David Cameron had William Hague there as his foreign sec. And so that shows the lack of confidence he has in himself, that he's not willing to have people around the room you can have a proper debate and argument with. And sometimes, by the way, as a leader, you should be willing to have your mind changed by good points made by your equals. And you shouldn't be scared to surround yourself with those who are more able than you. I mean, one of the things I've learned is actually you want people in the room who are more talented than you, who know more than you. What is the point of having people inside the room who are less talented, less able, and know less than you?
What, in all that being said, and I agree with all of it, why are Labour behind in the polls?
Well, I think we've got a big mission to do to rebuild the party. Keir's doing a good job in relation to the first stages of leadership. He's going to rebuild the machine. The Labour Party machine isn't what it used to be. He's going to set a direction of travel, and he's going to take people with him. Once we're in a better position as far as the party's concerned, I think you'll start seeing some improvements. But what we've got to do is speak to the country. I think we've got to stop having an echo chamber where we speak to ourselves. We can't speak to the converted. We've got to speak to those who we need to convert at the next general election. And polls will go up and down. The key thing is to make the tough calls now and get the foundations right. You've got to have the foundations solid if you're going to have a proper campaign going forward. And the honest answer is, Alastair, this will be, I suspect, a 4 or 5 year parliament. We've got to make sure that, using a sport analogy, if the general election is the World Cup finals, we've got to now use the period to get the right team in place. We've got to blood youngsters. We've got to make sure we get through the qualifications in relation to the right progress during the staging posts, and make sure we peak at the World Cup.
Okay. I would argue that one of the big qualifying games was the decision that you make on a Brexit deal that's going to do a lot of damage to the country. That, to me, was a big defeat. Am I right or am I wrong?
Well, my view is different as the Mayor of London to the New Labour Party. I suspect the New Labour Party is concerned about those parts of the country who did vote to leave the European Union and just want to see Brexit done. And so I suspect the New Labour Party, Keir, had at the fore of his mind in relation to the vote in Parliament. Clearly, somebody who's the Mayor of London, I can see how awful this deal is. This deal is basically a no-deal Brexit.
But you talked earlier about the new norm. I mean, the other thing that's the new norm, and I'm afraid I do worry that we're getting a bit like America in this, is the normalisation of lying in our politics. And when that is coming from the very top, the Prime Minister, that educative piece becomes much more difficult the more polarised the debate gets. And that's, I fear, the track that we're going down now. And so I worry that the educative piece, by saying, well, we've just got to accept Brexit now, we've just got to accept the deal, that we're rewarding and normalising behaviour that should be being called out as part of that educative piece.
So one of the things we've seen in America is Twitter have made the decision to permanently ban Donald Trump because he persistently tells lies. And I think one of the things we've got to do is look at what's happening in America. You've now seen in America publishers of his lies, but also members of his own party who didn't call out his lies, ruined that. And actually, many of them being held to account, saying, "What did you do? Were you in some way accomplices, or were you enabling that behaviour?" I think the same thing will start happening in this country in relation to publishers who, well, you know, firstly, thankfully, Boris Johnson hasn't gone quite as far as Donald Trump. But secondly, I think it will happen because I think the British people, by and large, are decent and can see through a fraud. And I think Boris Johnson will be found out for what he is, which is a fraud.
Well, I hope you're right. But I mean, like, you know, the liaison committee the other day, I mean, I just sat there watching. There was sort of, you know, nonsense after lie after nonsense coming out of his mouth. And yet within the debate, you know, if I think back to what it was like for us when, you know, every single word we said being analysed to the nth degree, mental health. He said the other day, we talked about mental health. He said the other day they're spending £12 billion on it. It's 500 million. It's out by a factor of 24. Yeah. And yet nobody bats an eyelid.
No, I think that is a concern we share in relation to people in positions of power, particularly this government, not being held to account. I think there is a responsibility for not just politicians in Parliament, but I think the media held into account. I think one of the things we saw a couple of years ago was him taking on the courts. And we're now seeing a politicisation of judges. We're seeing legislation being repealed because it challenges the power of government. We're seeing judicial review being curtailed because the government sees it as a way of inhibiting their power. And that's why I think we will see a reckoning in this country as well, because I think there'll come a stage where I think, you know, even those who are supportive of Boris Johnson will realise that it's possibly supportive to a Conservative government and realise Boris Johnson isn't the answer.
Well, I hope you're right. I really hope you're right, but I worry. I mean, look, you know, Priti Patel, Home Secretary, who goes around attacking people in your former profession for doing their job. Yeah, and absolutely. The Internal Market Bill challenging the rule of law. I mean, I worry that we're a little bit complacent about just how right-wing this government is.
One of the things I think people like me have to do is to explain why due process, natural justice, having access to a lawyer are so important. Because what happens is people read the stuff that the Home Secretary is saying in relation to, you know, lawyers being bad, you know, there should be flights in the middle of the night. Those people who are being deported should have access to judges because they're all murderers and rapists, and accept that premise. We're actually one of the best exports our country's ever given is human rights. It was British lawyers who wrote the European Convention of Human Rights and the United Nations Declaration. And so we've got to do a better job of explaining what human rights means. You know, it's what stops you being arrested in the middle of the night without due process. And so we've got to do a better job of explaining why she's so wrong. And that's what I meant about.
But equally, Sadiq, you could say that the previous generation, our generation, should have done a better job about explaining the benefits of the European Union. And because we were too late with it, we're now out. I just worry that on this kind of rule of law stuff and control of the media and, you know, taking on the BBC and all this stuff, this is the next stage of, I think, a pretty dangerous right-wing quasi-authoritarian agenda. It's not far off.
No, that's a fair worry to have, particularly when you see who's now being tasked with leading the BBC. Can you imagine if Tony Blair's government had done that, or Gordon Brown's government had done that and stuff? And so you're right to
Rishi Sunak's best mate.
Quite, because obviously bankers have a huge experience of running the BBC.
And do you think the next election is winnable?
Absolutely winnable. Absolutely.
And how confident how about your own re-election? How's that going?
I'm never complacent. You know, my focus is the pandemic. I think the election will be in May the 6th. You know, I want my socks off to win it. I think politics is more like boxing than the World Cup. I think it's possible to be knocked out even though you're really fit, you're in the best state of your life, and that's why you can't be complacent ever. And so I'm not complacent. I think if Boris Johnson is complacent, he's taking a risk doing so. I think it's possible for Labour to win the next general election, and I will work my socks off to make sure I win the next general election as well.
When you talked about the sort of, you know, the argument that Labour's got on policy that Labour's got to put out to the country, I mean, you know, to go back to your kind of World Cup analogy, it's not that far out now. Even if it is a long parliament, I don't get a sense yet of what the policy agenda is going to be and how it's going to differ from what we had in 2019.
Well, firstly, I never give advice to Keir publicly, but what I suspect, when you examine previous opposition leaders who've won general elections, the two best examples in recent times are David Cameron and Tony Blair. And if you use them as a sort of template, which I wouldn't advise, but actually you can learn a lot from them. What Tony Blair did and David Cameron did when they first became leaders of opposition was set a tonal shift and a tonal change about who they were. And that gave a direction of travel. So in Tony Blair's case, clause 4, in relation to tonal shift, but I'm not saying it was just that. That's incredibly unkind to what happened with New Labour. But it gave, for those that aren't, weren't that versed with Labour politics, what you saw was a new Labour leader who believed something differently to the past. David Cameron, tried to detoxify the Tory brand and did a number of things to show he was different. I think when you look at Keir's start in relation to accepting fully the recommendations of the report from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, accepting fully that we need to do whatever we can to get rid of anti-Semitism in our party, that showed a break from the past in relation to the previous leader. And I think what you'll see from Keir over the next period is more examples of tonal shift and a change of direction. One of the concerns I have, if we as a party were to unveil policy 3 years before a general election, is we've got no idea of the landscape in 3-4 years' time, particularly post-COVID and with what I call the new normal. And that's why I think he's right to talk a bit gingerly about new policy, but we as a party have got to set a change of direction and to make clear what Labour means now.
Okay, and just briefly on, I don't want to talk too much about Trump because he gets way too much airtime as it is, but what do you think it was all about? I mean, I know there's the obvious answer, you're a Muslim mayor of a famous city in the world, but there was something that went beyond that, the stuff that he used to call you out for. I mean, one, how did that make you feel? And two, what do you think? Was there anything deeper going on there that we don't know about?
Well, I think for those that know Trump, for Trump to explain his animus, I think what's quite clear, when you've dealt with bullies before, and I've dealt with bullies from the school playground up until now, is what they hate most of all is being taken on and being called out. And the remarkable thing about bullies is, what they got in common is all have thin skins, actually. They're actually quite weak. And with Trump I called him out. There's one ridiculous thing where he challenged me to an IQ test, Alastair. I mean, he's President of the United States of America. He's challenging me to IQ test. What's next? An arm wrestle. And I just think there was something about him. What was interesting was two things. One is you really found out who your mates were, but also who decent people were, because you had the British Prime Minister, the British Foreign Secretary, members of our government, owners and editors of newspapers, scared to say boo to a goose because it was Donald Trump, and allowing him to say things which were pretty distasteful, offensive, horrible about our values and about the elected mayor of London and all the rest of it. But you had others, when you say, hold on, this is wrong. This is wrong. I may not like Sadiq or his policies or his faith or the rest of the stuff, but actually this is wrong, and let's call it out. But let me tell you the thing that I find most upsetting is there were times over the last 5 years where I've been genuinely scared about my personal safety and my family's. I'm the first mayor ever to have police protection. You know what it entails. Panic buttons in the home and all the rest of it and stuff. I remember going to deliver a Fabian speech. This is the Fabian Society we're talking about, Alistair. What they think about violence and all the rest of it, where Trump supporters turned up to my Fabian speech with a guillotine. Right? And I just that is the consequence of Trump being elected the president and not being called out, because not only do we have, copycat leaders around the world, from Poland to Hungary to Brazil to Philippines and all the rest of it, but you've got a normalization of some of his values, and people who are on the periphery now in the mainstream. And that's the legacy. That's why it's really important with a coalition of decent people calling out those values.
Well, they had the hangman's noose outside the Capitol the other day, and they were putting Nancy Pelosi's head into it, and all the Democrats, and Pence at one point. There was the hang Pence stuff. No, I completely agree with you. But in terms of that sort of stuff about on the personal level, you felt it was really just because you're a Muslim, and because he's well connected to right-wing people here who don't like you.
A big part of that is that there's a phrase we use now, and it's just worth explaining: triggers or clickbaiting. There are certain things that trigger a response from people you want to trigger a response from, and there are certain people you clickbait. And what we're seeing, I'm afraid, and what Donald Trump has provided is a template how to motivate and whip up people. And my concern is we've seen in the UK now what used to be called in our day shock jocks, but radio presenters, journalists and others using that form of clickbait to get followers and supporters. And that's what leads to culture wars. Wars, aren't a good thing. The culture war is basically people whipping up their side into a frenzy because it gets more readers, it's good for business. We've got far out groups in this country who are using clickbait, and I'm a really good clickbait. I'm Labour, I'm a Muslim, I'm of Pakistani origin, of Asian heritage, and all the rest of it and stuff. I'm good clickbait for them to get supporters and followers and stuff. And so normally,
Priti Patel, she's the Home Secretary. She must know all that. She must know that that's what's driving all this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what motivates Priti and stuff. All I'd say is I know the temptation in going for the cheap shot, playing on people's fears, and all I say that's a really slippery slope. You're far better addressing people's fears than playing with them. And and I'd hope whether it's Priti Patel or others who are minorities who should have some empathy would understand what the consequence of opening Pandora's box is. It's not always good stuff; it's bad stuff as well.
Well, you mentioned your faith there. When you're going back to the beginning of this conversation, when you are in your sort of low moments and you're struggling a bit, how important is your faith?
It's really important, and one of the things that I think, one of the factors. There are many factors. One of the factors where I think I was feeling at a really low ebb, depressed, was not being able to go to congregational prayer. So every Friday, what I've done, Alastair, for years when I was a lawyer and also as an MP, try and carve out an hour on a Friday lunchtime to go to congregational prayer. And that's really important for me. I call it nourishment of the soul because it just gives you a center, gives you a focus. And so, I can pray at home, and I do pray at home, not quite the same. Faith is important to me. By itself, it doesn't give me the resilience I need. So I need to do other things as well. And I suspect, and again, it's, maybe for another time, when we were talking about suicide, I've spoken to lots of people about mental ill health. And one of the things that I think a number of the major faiths share in common, and you'll know this, is inverted commas, suicide is seen as a sin. And I suspect, and also don't forget, we learn things over years, we're socialized. And I suspect one of the things at the back of my mind, again, we talked about going to GPs, is, I've sort of, as a young age, know this, that's a no-go area, even before having a lovely wife and kids, and, I've got a lovely family. And I think, again, it's funny how we're socialized, and I know you've talked about this nurture and nature and stuff, but it's really important. It's part of who I am. It's part of my identity, my faith.
But that thing about, the fact that I'm open, for example, has had a really big impact on stuff like insurance. Our premiums for anything are sort of whacked up because I'm out there talking about all this stuff. There's loads of reasons why not to do it. That's all and they're still there.
Yeah, all I'd say is, though, look, just use me as an example. Over the last year, I think it's been of benefit to me personally, but also it's benefited my family because we're now talking about this stuff more than we were in the past. But also, and it's like I come from a family of 6 brothers and 1 sister, right? We grew up, you had to be tough to survive in our council estate. You had to be tough. We all joined a boxing gym very early. My brothers, won medals and championships. They still run the boxing club. We're hard, honestly. But me talking about it's helped, I think, all of us, but helped others, I hope, as well. It's not common for people of faith or people of colour to talk about this, right? And that's one of the reasons I think me talking about it hopefully will mean fewer people suffering in silence.
Good. Well, I think I'm about done. Okay. Well, listen, lovely to talk to you.
Thanks, Alastair. Love to Grace. I love to Fiona and the family. Take care.
Yeah. I'll see you soon. Take care.
Yeah.